Ask members of the committee to put on record any interest we may have. This is our final evidence session into the two inquiries we're doing into the private rented sector and the draft tenant fees bill. Thank you very much for coming this afternoon. I'm a Vice President of the Local Government Association. I own one property which I rent out. If we just go around the table.
I employ two councillors in my constituency office.
I employ a councillor in my staff team.
I employ a councillor in my office.
I'm Vice President of the LGA and also have a small property portfolio.
And I'm a county councillor in Warwickshire, and I also have a shared property that I rent out with my sister.
I employ a councillor in my staff team.
I'm a fellow of the Royal Institution of Chancellors.
Okay, Mr. Thank you very much for coming on that side of the table for the first time.
Yes.
I was almost anticipating, like the football manager comes back to their old club, having gone to manage elsewhere, and gets in the wrong dugout when they start off. But on this occasion, you got the right seat first time, and you're very welcome on your first appearance before the committee. And congratulations on your new role.
Thank you, Chairman. That's very kind. And seeing as we're declaring interest, I also employ a councillor. I employ a husband of a councillor. My husband is a councillor, and my daughter has one rented out property. So that's everything, I think.
Right, nearly as much as the rest of us put together. But that's okay. Perhaps you could introduce your staff members.
Indeed, I have a phalanx of people around me. The A team are here for you, lovely committee. So I have Anne and Becky, who I think you've already met before, have given evidence to you. And so they're guys from the private rented sector team and the bill team as well in HCLG.
Okay. Right, okay. Can we just begin then with talking about the... I think you indicated you'd like to make an opening statement to the committee before we ask questions of you, if that's okay?
Very, very, very briefly, Chairman. Thank you very much indeed. So very, very grateful for you giving me the opportunity to briefly set out what the government has done to improve the effectiveness of the private rented sector. And particularly can I thank the committee for the detailed inquiry that you've undertaken, the individuals and organisations that you've spoken to and all those that have participated. It's absolutely clear that everyone shares our ambition to deliver a fairer, good quality private rented sector. It's particularly important now. 1 in 5 households in England now live in a private rented sector. And there are a range of challenges and that determine and drive policy interventions. So we support the majority of good landlords and agents who provide decent, well-managed homes, and I want to work with them to ensure that tenants have access to good, quality, affordable accommodation. Nearly finishing, Chairman, we've already taken action that recognises that more needs to be done, but just to give you a snapshot, we support the Karen Bucks private member bill. We are introducing banning orders on the worst rogue landlords. We've launched a consultation on mandatory electrical safety checks and are extending mandatory licences for HMO properties and have committed to a review of the selective licensing regime. We want to protect tenants and ensure that they have access to effective dispute resolution when things go wrong. And on 18th of February, just last week, we launched our consultation on strengthening redress in the housing market. So we want to work with Parliament and all the sectors to deliver these changes coherently, and again to repeat, very grateful for the work that your committee have done on private rented sector now, and then later on when we get to talk about the tenants fees bill, the scrutiny that you've been kindly giving that.
Thank you, Minister, for that, and I'm sure we'll come back to pick up many of those particular issues that you've highlighted for us there. I think from the evidence we've had, it's pretty clear that there have been some general improvement in standards and quality in the private rented sector, say, since the turn of the century. But there is still an element of very bad landlords and very bad properties, which I know the landlords associations are as anxious as we are to see action taken against. And in some senses, some of those properties may be getting worse as the opportunities for exploitation make themselves apparent to some of the worst landlords, the criminals in the business. Have you any sense of the scale of that particular problem that exists?
Certainly, allegorically, is that the right word? We've heard that, but actually the statistics don't really show that to be the case. So we welcome very much the close working relationship with the Residential Landlords Association, and it's helpful that they are looking into standard too, but we don't agree with the assertion that things are getting worse. Overall, the proportion of non-decent homes in the private sector has declined from 47% in 2006 to 27% in 2016. We are determined to continue to drive up standards in the PRS, and the overall quality of private rented sector housing has improved rapidly over this past decade, but an unacceptably high number of people still live in non-decent accommodation.
Right. Okay, but that's quite what the RLA said to us, and the NLA as well, was that yes, those figures are right. The percentage of decent homes is improving, so general standards may be going up, but the really bad properties, the very bad properties, the very bad landlords are still there, and there's no indication at all that they're going away, and that sector of the market is actually improving in any shape or form. I mean, that's the case, isn't it?
Genuinely, I hear what you say, and again, we do hear these comments out there. The difficulty is that because we've got the housing health and safety rating system now, which is working really, really well, properties with the hazards has declined from 31% in 2008 to 17% in 2015. So, and those are the latest years that data is available. So, you know, we've not seen a decline in standards, but if the RLA would like to send the evidence to us, then we'd be very happy to look at it.
I think that's going back to the same issue, isn't it? It's not the 83% in some ways we're concerned about, it's that 17%. So the 17% may be smaller than it was, but within that 17% are still some really bad cases, some really bad landlords, some criminals. And has there been any sense of the scale of that particular element of the extreme problem of really bad landlords managing really bad properties in an awful way?
To be frank, I think that's one of the reasons why we were happy to support the Karen Butt bill, because we think that the new opportunities for tenants to feel empowered on the 11 issues of hazard, to go to either the environmental health officers and make them do something about it, or indeed to go to court straight away.
But has the government any idea of the scale of the problem of really bad properties and really bad landlords?
Anne, please.
So we'd heard that the Landlord Association had talked about these figures. We haven't seen those figures. I think the thing that we have coming in, which should help with this across the board, is the banning orders and the rogue landlord database. That will help local authorities and ourselves get a real scale of how many really bad landlords there are out there, and focus our actions on them.
Okay, we'll probably come back and ask one or two questions about enforcement in due course and what authorities are doing. But let's ask about the local housing allowance, because just again some evidence, and we had it from some of the London authorities, but also from Blackpool in particular. Okay. We said there was almost a perverse incentive now to split what might be quite reasonable accommodation into smaller accommodation, into small flats and bet sits, rather than larger accommodation, because the local housing allowance means they can get more money by letting 3 small units instead of 1 larger unit. Is that a problem that the government recognises? And if the government recognises it, is the government determined to do anything about it?
Yeah, I mean, we're not happy that any tenant should use or should be made to use housing benefit to drive down standards, and that's something that we would not accept ought to be happening in the market. It's not an intended consequence of where we are with housing benefit. So equally, when it comes to housing benefit, we've all got to cut our cloth accordingly. Just because I might like another extra bedroom and so I have to increase my mortgage, well, you know, you've got to have what you can afford from the housing benefit that's there. But the difficulty is that people are clever about getting around rules, and that's not acceptable. And that is certainly something that we would not happy. I mean, the lettings agents bill, when we get to it later on, that would be a really interesting area where we can drive down with HMRC about where standards ought to be.
Okay, right. So the government not happy that the housing benefits and the local housing allowance could be perversely encouraging landlords to subdivide properties in a way which makes them really poor accommodation. Right, the government aren't happy. Are the government going to do anything about it?
Well, it's particularly, I know you've mentioned Blackpool, but it's particularly more of a London issue.
It's a London issue.
With the lockdown rules.
Well, we'll come on to lockdown in a minute.
Sure, okay.
But Blackpool specifically mentioned it in terms of what was happening there with the old guest houses being, subdivided into tiny accommodation, because that was the way landlords are making a lot of money for poor accommodation.
Well, clearly, when it comes to licensing and HMOs, then that is about driving standards. And so that is something that we would expect housing authorities to be able to use their powers to act on.
Right. So local authorities have got powers to stop that happening, have they, the subdivision of properties in the West?
If it's not acceptable, then you don't get the housing benefit. If it's not an acceptable property.
They've also got a range of HMO licensing powers. I think probably this one, the one that would apply most, would be additional licensing, where you'd focus right into areas if you thought this was a particular area in the locality. Right. And that would be the way of ensuring that, because this is a standards issue in the main.
Yes.
And that would be a way of ensuring the standards in that particular.
But you'd have to use licensing to get into those powers.
There are a range of options open to them, but I would have thought in this case it would be additional licensing that would be the most suitable.
Right. But if there's a range of powers, perhaps you could let us have a note about what all the powers might be, as well as the licensing.
Sure.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. On to question 2.
Do you agree, Minister, that the power imbalance between tenants and landlords makes it very difficult for tenants to pursue complaints out of fear of retaliatory eviction and rent increases?
That was one of our concerns. And so that's why we're committed to rebalancing the relationship between tenants and landlords. We've recently announced a number of changes to help ensure tenants have the ability and confidence to make a complaint about the standard of their accommodation. We're going to make it mandatory for every landlord to be subject to a redress scheme, and we're exploring whether a single housing ombudsman could simplify access for redress for tenants.
Thank you. Some witnesses have told us that the Deregulation Act in 2015, which made retaliatory evictions illegal, while a step in the right direction, doesn't provide sufficient protection for tenants from retaliatory evictions. And I was wondering if you have data on how often that power has been used.
I don't have that data. I don't know whether one of my gang has, but the interesting thing about the 2015 Act, it has been incredibly important to giving protection for tenants on retaliatory eviction. We want to link the effectiveness of those provisions to the work we're taking forward to improve the redress system in the sector. We do recognise that more needs to be done to protect tenants, and we're committed to improving the redress for people who experience problems with their housing and to empower them to challenge poor practice.
And so there is, a series of measures around redress, of which the Housing Ombudsman proposals are the key element, I believe. But then there is the question of revenge evictions and how tenants can be given sufficient security to know that they can raise a complaint about a serious issue in their property without themselves being directly subject to that. So different question about redress once it's happened.
Yeah.
But could you say a little bit more about whether the government has any plans specifically to protect tenants further from retaliatory evictions and also the rent increases that can come all too often if a tenant raises a complaint?
Right, well, getting back to basics on that, the important thing again, since April 2017, we've extended the rent repayment orders so that tenants who recover, they can recover the rent paid where they've been illegally evicted and where a landlord has failed to comply with an improvement notice served by a local authority. So not only is there redress, but there is rent repaid to that tenant who will have been evicted illegally.
But if they've lost their home, that's, it's helpful to get the money back, but it's cold comfort if you're then in the, whatever the homelessness sector has to offer you. If you've lost the home that you were in and there's only redress after that point in time, that's a limited protection. It might give redress, but it's limited protection for tenants, isn't it?
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. No, I hear what you're saying. It's interesting because there's been a lot of conversation about whether we ought to have a housing court. And so we are consulting with the judiciary on that, because and that will help with the current system. We're requiring all letting agents to be regulated and to belong to a client money protection scheme, which will also help tenants. And finally, obviously, again, supporting the Karen Buck Bill, giving tenants the alternative means of redress. So those are the things the government is going to do.
And I appreciate that the consultation on the Single Housing Ombudsman was only launched last week, and you're consulting at the moment. Could you say something about the powers that you imagine the new Ombudsman might have to protect tenants in the private rented sector specifically?
Yes, we've found that with the three best known ombudsman schemes that there are around at the moment that help within the housing area, that there are gaps. And so what we are trying to do is close those gaps and also address any confusion with landlords and tenants as well. So what we're looking for is, frankly, we're only in a position to set out the next steps once we've had the consultation and when we've looked through the replies that we've got in. So we've asked for, in the consultation, for views on the powers of redress. Should they include powers to make financial awards, expel members, refer cases to relevant enforcement authorities and regulators? And the other thing, don't forget please, is that since April 17 we introduced civil penalties of up to £30,000 as an alternative to prosecution, and that is a very strong statement from the government.
Is it likely that all private landlords will have to be a member of the Ombudsman?
Yes, indeed. Well, of whichever Ombudsman system we go for in the end, whether it's a single portal and there are others behind it, but that is to be decided. But yes.
I should just qualify that and say
it's a redress scheme.
No, I was just going to say that there is a question in the consultation around if the landlord is a member of an agent, whether or not they have to join the redress scheme. So that's one of the questions in the consultation. So all landlords, the tenants of all landlords will need to be covered by a redress scheme, but it might be through the agent if the landlord chooses to do it that way. But
exactly.
Just that slight clarification.
Mark, you want to say you just said in answer there, you haven't got any figures about how often the powers under the Deregulation Act have been used with regard to stopping retaliatory eviction. Is that because the department doesn't collect the figures, or you simply haven't got them with you today?
I haven't got them with me today.
So the department does have them?
I don't know.
The department doesn't collect those figures.
No.
It's local authorities that collect those figures.
So somebody has the figures today?
The local authorities will.
But individual local authorities have
them. But not there's no overview of whether the Act is working or not.
We're going to do a review of the Deregulation Act, but we're going to take it forward as part of the mandatory landlord consultation provisions and looking at how that's all working together.
So what's the timing for that?
Well, the legislation was introduced in 2015 and we're now doing the consultation on mandatory landlord redress now. Right,
so as part of that redress, are you doing a review of whether the Deregulation Act is working?
We're not doing a specific review on that, but because it's been sort of overtaken by the commitment to mandate landlords join a redress scheme. So as part of taking that work forward, we would look at sort of the protections that tenants have.
Right, but I think it would be helpful to the committee to find out if anybody knows whether this piece of legislation is working.
We can take that away.
You can.
We'll take that away.
And come back to us.
Yes.
Having asked local authorities what's happening with some figures. Yes?
Happy to do that, Chairman.
Yeah, okay.
Happy to do that, Chairman.
Thank you. Mike.
Yes, you touched upon this, and that's we heard evidence about the increase in growth of lockdown properties, particularly in the London boroughs, where basically small family housing are turned into multiple flats to maximise housing benefit. What more can the government do to help local authorities, particularly the London boroughs, tackle this issue?
Right. I mean, we did mention that before, and you're quite right. We think that it's a way of trying to get around HMO licensing, and so the changes that we're bringing in won't just be 5 people or more on 3 floors. It'll be 5 people on 2 floors, and I think that'll be a major difference. So that'll be another 1,600 properties at least that will come into the HMO licensing arrangement. So the local authorities will have to step up and deal with that. but we genuinely expect all local authorities to ensure they use the powers that are available to them to robustly tackle abuse of the system and enforce property standards, because it is about property standards as opposed to just the knock-on effect on housing benefit as well.
So you don't feel it requires a change in the law? It's basically using the current provision that's available to local authorities in a more of a robust way?
That's right. We honestly think that the Planning Act of 2016 has got an enforcement tool for local authorities, and also that from London's point of view, the Greater London Act of 1999 also helps them out with powers that they have.
Okay. Shelter gave evidence suggesting that actually a new band for LHA would be useful. Is that something you consider for studio flats?
We use housing benefit to help cover rental housing costs. It's not actually used to cover quality. So introducing a link between housing benefit and the quality of accommodation could have unintended consequences. Having said that, we are working very closely with the DWP to see what other levers and incentivise quality that we have. And we expect local authorities to crack down on rogue landlords. And this is where it really comes back to what we want to do in the first place. We want to be even-handed with the good landlords, and we want to crack down on the rogue landlords. And this would be an area where we feel that there's opportunity for local authorities to do that, particularly with the civil penalties of up to £30,000. It's not putting an extra new financial burden on local authorities to do that when they know that there is that opportunity for the civil penalties.
Thank you.
And then on this.
I just wanted to follow up on that. So, Minister, you said that housing benefit is used to cover costs, not quality. Because there is a cap with the LHA, there becomes an inevitable link between quality and the LHA. So, I mean, in the local authority areas that I represent, for example, they are on a very, very swift trajectory to a situation where there will be no properties in either borough that will be fully covered by the LHA cap. What that means is that you end up with a larger and larger number of tenants chasing the poorest quality accommodation because that's all they're able to access in the market. And so I'd argue that if the LHA is there to cover costs, that's one thing, but a capped LHA inevitably has a much more complicated relationship with quality than that. I just wondered if you could comment on that.
Sure. I mean, of course, you forget, or not forget, you don't mention the discretionary housing benefit allowance. And so councils can top that up.
Which is shrinking, running out. I mean, London have no more DHP available until the end of the financial year. It's gone. Practically the end of February, so there was 4 weeks left before the new financial year. Normally in December, local authorities know how at risk they are of going to the wire on that, and local authorities are in a position where they can write to the department about it. And I certainly know other councils have done that. And the department will grant additional funding in those circumstances? Certainly did for my council.
Open check there. Okay, thank you, Minister.
Before I got here, I hastened to add.
This is clearly specific. It's not just limited to London, but it is a very big London-wide issue. And of course, there is a perverse incentive right now on landlords to break up these properties and let to single people, and then claim housing benefit on the properties, which enormously increases the rental income. The quality can be very good. That's not but the size of property is, well, pokey to put it mildly. So I think that and I understand completely, it's not necessarily your decision to make, it may be a DWP decision on housing benefit, but are you looking with the DWP to reduce or eliminate this perverse incentive to actually create these properties in the first place?
Yes, as part of a bigger picture, it is one of the areas that we're looking at and working very closely with them. But particularly, I think I need to reinforce, this is part of the work that we're dealing with on rogue landlords, because I think that that's where the public would expect us to protect the public purse at the same time as looking after tenants who, as the lady says, sorry, I'm not allowed to call you Helen, am I? I beg your pardon. It's very difficult that tenants in the private rented sector who quite often are guided there by the private rented sector staff in the housing the local authority housing team. It's almost like a catch-22, isn't it? That we've got to make sure that the quality is there, and that's why we feel that having the civil penalties for the local authorities, for the environmental health officers, that is the right way to go on this.
But I come back to the issue. It isn't always the quality. I mean, the quality can be very good, but it's the space and the space standards that are being applied. And it allows a property that maybe would have one level of rent to suddenly have quadrupled the amount of rent, or even more, by splitting up into smaller units, specifically for single homeless people. And this is the perverse incentive that I'm trying to make sure that we are going to see some action from government. It might be quite right that we provide housing benefit for people in those conditions or position, but we're acting a deliberate perverse incentive on removing family housing and putting in accommodation for single homeless people, which has all sorts of implications, but in particular leads to a huge profit for landlords.
Well, as the person who managed to steer through a very special bill
Indeed.
To become an act in this Parliament, looking after particularly single home or potentially single homeless people, I think you've almost it's an issue that we will look at again.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Are you going to have a note on that at some point?
Chairman, you're getting my people to write a lot of notes.
Yes, I'm sure that's what they enjoy doing. Okay, right. Okay, I think it would be very helpful if we could have a... Thank you very much indeed. Mark.
Chairman, thank you. Minister, can we look at the regulatory framework for the private rented sector as a whole? Certainly through this inquiry, both oral evidence and written evidence has shown that there's actually a lot of legislation. The problem is it isn't necessarily interwoven, it isn't necessarily coherent. One person described it like a ship having a lot of barnacles. Does the government have any plans to overhaul the legislation so it's more coherent and integrated, and therefore easier for both tenants and landlords to understand and apply?
I do appreciate why you asked that question, and we've heard the evidence that has come to the committee that there is this piecemeal legislation, or it seems as though it's piecemeal legislation. I think you've got to be a little bit more careful there and be a bit more nuanced, because the existing legislation is delivering results in terms of improving standards and quality. So, we want to work with the sector to ensure that this is a coherent way forward. Oh. That's a great ringtone. My God. But equally that not just working with the good landlords, but also that it's a key issue for people to understand their rights, for tenants to understand their rights. So we feel that it's a way forward is to support people more, that they understand and use the legislation effectively. So that's the sort of action that we're taking to do. I mean, Chairman, what we're looking to do is to explain the legislation that's out there, rather than introducing a new overarching primary legislation to bring it all together. We don't think that there's real appetite for that out there.
Can I follow that on then? I mean, the housing health and safety rating system is in many ways based on data that goes back 12 years in terms of the quality or the assessment of the actual properties. So a lot of it's out of date. Is this not somewhere where actually the government could usefully update this? It doesn't necessarily mean passing primary legislation, but it could actually making sure that the way in which that legislation operates relates to houses and standards as they are today.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely spot on. And one of the jobs I've had to sign off on in the last 3.5 weeks, or however long it is I've been here, is we have these how-to guides. And so we are updating the new how-to guides for tenants, for landlords, and for people in the profession, if you like. And so one of the things, many of the private rented sector, they're almost accidental landlords. They inherit granny's house or whatever it is. And so they make mistakes because they don't really know what they're doing. Things like the deposit. They don't realise that it's actually got to be not just in a separate bank account, but actually in an accredited scheme. And if they get that wrong, there's a massive fine that they can have that is automatic. There's no, but I did do the right thing and they were going to get it back. That doesn't cut the ice. The law is written as it's written. So that is now going to be on the front page of the how-to guide for landlords, which protection scheme is the deposit money in, not have you done it, which one is it in? So things like that we're updating, and they're going to be out very soon. I had a briefing over the weekend and I thought that they were going to be launched this Sunday. I don't know why we launch things on Sundays, but anyway, I was going to say something else, but never mind. My day of rest, I'm listening to the Archers, I'm not launching how-to guides on Sundays. But anyway, it was a bit of a misunderstanding. So we're going to be doing that around about Easter time instead.
Okay, so a slightly different Sunday, but
yes, an even more important
even more important Sunday. So you're looking to do the clarification now, rather than necessarily waiting for the tenants' fees bill. You're going to do something now, and then perhaps redraft that again, maybe later in the year. We'll
see how this goes, because I think that this they are actually updated regularly. Becky and I have been talking about it quite a lot, and I didn't realise quite how regularly the how-to guides are updated. But the tenants' fee bill will come on to a bit later.
And you recognise the need for the HHSRS?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Karen Buck bill is going to do that.
And I recognise you asked a question specifically about the HHSRS, and it's going to be constantly under review. We're constantly looking at that. At the moment, we've got Dame Judith Hackett looking at fire safety. Our commitment is to wait until we've seen her report and then work through whether we need to review the HHSRS off the back of that. It would be strange to do it beforehand.
Yeah. Just coming on to Karen Buck's bill, Minister, I think one of the issues here is that obviously most of us applaud the importance of giving tenants greater powers or a sense of greater power. But looking at the practicalities of a tenant, as you said, it's quite difficult for tenants to know what their rights are and what the law is. But the test, if you like, here in this bill, the idea that tenants will have the right to take landlords to court themselves, sounds great, but the challenge is then, how does that work in practice? We heard quite sceptical views, including from local authorities, as to whether tenants will be able to do that. What's the government thinking on this as to how tenants will be able to do that? I mean, one person suggested that having a criminal test as part of discussions actually makes it a harder thing for tenants to engage with, and there may be an argument for having a lower test in addition. But what's the government's view about enabling tenants to take that right and make it a practical reality?
Right. I actually think this is a little bit carrot and stick. And so I think that these new opportunities for tenants to go direct to court, I don't actually think it'll, in 99 out of 100 cases, it won't get that far. I think that most tenants will decide whether they are going to bring cases, but there'll be clear visual evidence that there is a serious hazard in the property. And I think then that will incentivise the environmental health authorities to actually act on behalf of the tenants, and with the incentive that the civil penalties will be actually kept by the local housing authority. And similarly, if there are any issues over the rents, then the payment back can go to the tenant as well. So I think that there is actually it's almost like another opportunity for the housing authority to actually use its muscle. But it does empower the tenants if they want to, and ultimately, if a tenant is eligible, they will get legal aid.
Right. Okay. So your expectation is that most cases won't go to court, but that rather you see this as a way in which local authorities can have properties highlighted to them as being
Could I
problematic?
clarify? Because I think that the key thing on the Karen Buck Bill is that tenants themselves can take the initiative, and that's what it's supposed to be about, and that they can enforce. I agree with the Minister. The way it's currently drafted, relying on the HHSRS, in our view, it means they will be able to see if there is a hazard that is applicable. Assuming the bill goes through, we would provide guidance to tenants in any case. But our expectation is that that power provided to tenants will mean that landlords are less likely to want to go to court, because they know that proof is there up front.
Right. And obviously, they, as you said, after the Dame Judith Hackett, that those regulations will be updated as well in that context.
We will look to see whether we need to on the back of that, yes.
Okay.
Yes, I just wanted to come back to the HHSRS.
Yes, catchy thing does, doesn't it?
Yes. You were talking about, you were being asked about whether or not that would be updated, and you said you regularly update things. Now, we heard from some of the chartered institutes last week and from some local authorities about the difficulties of working with the current HHSRS, because my understanding is it was published in the early 2000s, 2006, but actually the data predates that. So will the department be looking at a thorough review of those standards to make them applicable to today's housing market and today's standards?
Yeah, I mean, we've actually said quite categorically that a decision on whether the guidance on the HSRS will need to be updated will be taken following the review of the Judith Hackett review, and we're not going to preempt that at all.
No, I understand that point and absolutely take that point on board. But of course there will be much in those safety standards as well, and what I'm seeking is whether there is an acceptance that there is a general need for update given the changing in the housing market and housing stock in the meantime to ensure tenant safety. So you talked specifically about building regulations and the Karen Buck bill. Will there be a thoroughgoing review of
Sorry, it depends what you mean by thorough. Obviously, we want to keep this under review. Obviously, we want to make sure that this is something that is easy to use for everybody that needs to use it. It's really difficult to say now exactly how that review will progress, not least because we need to wait for the Hackett review to be published. But we will be looking at this with the eye on how useful it is.
Right. So is there an acceptance that the information contained in the HHSRS is out of date?
No, I mean, the 11 tests are very straightforward, and I think that they are as strong today as they were in 2004. So I don't agree with you.
Right. Well, it's not really me.
Okay. Well, I beg your pardon.
It's the chartered institutes were telling us that they found them difficult to use in today's context. So that's why I'm asking the question.
That's very interesting.
Okay. Right.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, I understand that through the English Housing Survey, there's an estimated 720,000 properties in the private rented sector which have one or more Category 1 issues with them. Yet there are, according to in 2016, there was a survey done which showed that only 6 out of 10 local authorities had failed to prosecute landlords for these sorts of conditions. Why do you think the enforcement in local authorities is so low?
It's shockingly surprising, and that'll give you the headline for the day. Wonderful. I think what's important is that I think that the government has recognised this, which is why it brought in April 2017 the change in the civil penalties and the extension of the rent repayment orders. And I think that there is an opportunity there for environmental health officers to really get to grips with these sorts of things. Now that because I mean, we all know it's an expensive thing for a council to enter into these sorts of inquiries. And so having the civil penalty actually rest and stay with the local authority, and particularly if it's housing benefit rent as well, then that housing benefit rent will be repaid by the rogue landlord as part of that penalty, and that money then goes straight back into improving housing in that area. And I think that's a massive incentive for councils to do more.
It was interesting last week that we heard from Bournemouth, I think Boston and Wandsworth authorities. Very different experiences, very different approaches seemingly, and how they went about enforcing and what levels of prosecution. Of the 6 in 10 that had failed to prosecute that I was just referring to, I think of the total number of prosecutions, it was something like, was it Newham had accounted for half of all prosecutions. So there's a real disparity between those authorities that are going after it and those who aren't. And what we were hearing in evidence last week was that it's actually, clearly it's quite expensive for cash-strapped authorities. And it's not a political point, it's just the reality. And in all sorts of enforcement, of licensing, whatever it may be, authorities are saying, is it really worth going after that landlord for very little return, even though, as you say, the money can go back into the pot?
Well, I would be frankly appalled if that's what they said. Secondly, I'd be hugely disappointed if that is what they said. That is their duty to do it. And so the fact that we've now, and the difficulty I think is, it was only April 17 that these new powers and the money staying with the authority, and particularly the rent payment staying with the authority and going into specifically housing area. So it's relatively new, isn't it?
I think it's about cost. It's cost versus benefit, or cost versus return. And they're saying the returns just aren't there.
No, because apart from anything else,
going through are just paltry.
Again, I hear what you're telling me, but I don't accept that, because it is that council's duty to do that. And if I'm sure any leader of any council heard their officers say cost-benefit analysis on this, that would be outrageous. And that is their duty to do this on behalf of clearing rogue landlords out of it. This is why one of the things that's important that's coming along is the banning orders. And I think that is going to be a really massive change. But it is for the local authorities to do their job.
I certainly hear what you say. Just a further point. The Controlling Migration Fund has made £100 million available over 4 years to the year 19 to 20 financial year for local authorities to tackle local service pressures associated with recent migration, including tackling criminal landlords. How effective has this funding been, and will the government make available any additional funding to support local authorities make use of the new powers they've been given in recent years?
That's a really good question, because it's as though, and again, it's all the way around the country, different local authorities have got different issues with this. But out of the 100 million that's available, 53 million has been allocated already. It's actually, as most of these projects run for 2 years, it's too soon to say how successful the actual project has been. But we are commissioning an evaluation into the programme and are funding individual evaluation projects where the money has already been allocated, and certain councils have actually already started the work. We do want to make sure that we are getting value for money for this, that it's actually doing what it's meant to do. And so with the 53 million out of the 100 million that's already been allocated, we're putting it on a pause. We want to do these evaluations, and so then later in the summer we will open up the scheme again for other councils and other projects, so that there is more money coming along if councils want to apply.
Just out of I'm sort of fairly new to this, but how does that budget, how does that divide up by all the authorities that there are out there? How much would they have on average each?
No, it's for local authorities to apply. It's a bidding process.
Okay, thank you.
Bob? Yes, Minister, moving on to licensing systems, which I think it's fair to say this committee has heard conflicting evidence about the benefits of selective licensing, and clearly you're going to be, or you've already announced that you're going to be looking at what you're going to do on selective licensing. So could you just explain to the committee what the review will cover and when your review will take place?
We agree that selective licensing has been an interesting new tool. And so we do want to see where it's targeted to address particular problems in an area associated with private rented sector. And so where it's working well, we want to make sure that that good practice spreads out to other areas that are similar. But it is very, very different across the country. It really, really is. So we want to make sure that where we review this selective licensing, we're launching this review after the Easter recess. And the plan of the review is to undertake the research into the effectiveness of selective licensing, and the findings will determine whether any changes need to be made or not.
So specifically, will you be looking at the quality improvements where selective licensing has been implemented?
It's really more about whether the licensing has been used as a tool to attack the problems that the councils at the time came to us saying that they wanted it for. Because there are 4 different types, and so it could be about antisocial behaviour, or it could be about rogue landlords, or it could be about the immigration fund, or whatever it might be, so, and students, or whatever it is. So we need to drill down into those 4 areas, because it isn't a catch-all. I recently was looking at some councils that had put in for selective licensing, and each time I have to balance the evidence that they've given me that it applies or it doesn't apply. So I might agree to it on an HMO basis, but I wouldn't agree to it on a antisocial behaviour basis. And so it is very much a jigsaw across the whole of the country.
Okay, one of the issues that has been raised with us, notably by Newham, I think, was the issue of landlords paying the due tax on rent that they receive. Is that going to be included in your review?
We are working with HMRC, but they are actually leading on this work. So they're leading on the work considering whether more should be done to encourage landlords subject to licensing to comply with tax laws. HMRC have actually opened up a consultation on this, so it's their piece of work rather than ours, and that consultation is not closed yet, so it is at an early stage.
And at the moment, there's almost no requirement for a landlord to declare they own a property or to declare to a local authority they own a property. Are you considering that change?
Not to have a national register, no.
Right.
We think it would be hugely bureaucratic.
Register.
And
a local register?
Different councils do it different ways. Many councils have a voluntary register, and that works very well because that helps then with grants and things like that. And also, I think what we will probably do is, again, my favourite carrot and stick, is that when we get to the banning orders and we have this list of rogue landlords, I think that will be very important for local authorities.
Okay, all right. You've mentioned about the process that you go through in terms of determining selective licence applications. There's been criticism from several local authorities saying the process is very slow, very bureaucratic, and they believe unnecessary. Do you think now, as we sit here, that the rules that require local authorities to apply if it's 20% of their area are correct, or should they be deregulated? Should local authorities have more freedom over what they do, or are you going to tighten the rules?
I think the difficulty is that because there are 4 tests that we look at, and each area is genuinely different, I don't think it would be appropriate to change the rules right now. And I think it is sensible that it does rest with central government on the licensing side of things. Equally, we're doing a review and evaluating where we've got so far with areas that have been licensed. And I will want to see the evidence that comes out of that review. I don't think it's appropriate to say more until I've actually seen the evidence from that review.
How many local authorities have had requests refused for selective licensing schemes?
I know they have. I don't have that figure now. Anybody have that figure? I think it's more not that they've been turned down 100%, but they've been turned down on one aspect of the 4 or 2 aspects of the 4. Right. And so the last one I signed off, they wanted 100% of the area. It ended up being 52% of the area. They wanted it on 4 reasons, antisocial behaviour. On one area I granted antisocial behaviour because there was evidence for it. On 2 other areas I didn't grant the licensing on antisocial behaviour. So it was more individually drilled down areas rather than a blanket.
So from your perspective, what are the alternatives available to local authorities that don't have selective licensing schemes?
Well, they can go back to Article 4, can't they, for planning, if that's what they wanted to do. I mean, I know many councils don't want to do that. I appreciate why. Yes. But, you know, it is a power that they have. But even so, I don't think that there's any reason or intention that if they present me the evidence, then I will grant that licence.
Okay. I mean, the landlords associations have been quite critical about licensing schemes. And say that there are positive alternatives. Will you look at those positive alternatives as a means of enforcing the improvements to quality that we want to see?
Always happy to look at new evidence, always happy. I think the difficulty is that it's as ever, isn't it? It's the rogue landlord we want to get at. Yeah. It's not the good landlord. And so if the Residential Landlords Association, whoever, can work with their local council, as I say, I mean, I know a number of councils have a voluntary list and a voluntary scheme. Well, if you can do that, then that's fantastic. And that's how it ought to be.
Okay, right, thank you.
Okay, just want a couple of points there. I knew you when you used to be a localist. So do you really think you know better than, say, the councillors in Blackpool Council about what's best for their area?
Believing in localism, they will come to me with the evidence, and the evidence will say whether it's acceptable or not. There has to be a high threshold. If we're bringing in very strong laws and quite bureaucratic workload for different groups, which therefore will have a knock-on effect of cost, let alone the licence to register at all, then I think that it has to have a high threshold, and I think that's appropriate.
When if you're not prepared then to just allow local authorities to make the decisions, as part of your review, will you have a look at the process that they have to go through in order to get a selective licence scheme? I think everyone complains that it's bureaucratic and burdensome and costly, and we've talked about the cost pressures on local authorities. Will you have a look at that as part of your review?
I'm very happy to, Chairman.
Right, okay. Just one other point that Bob Blackman raised, and this issue about finding out who actually owns property so we can start taxing them on their rental income. There was a discussion, not in this Parliament, one before last, I think, that the Angela Watkinson brought in a private member's bill about requiring local authorities to collect information about who owned from residents about who owned the properties they lived in. And the government drew attention to the fact that local authorities do have that power to do that as part of the council tax returns. And I think even issued some guidance to local authorities explaining what the power was. Would you have another look at that? Because I don't think many authorities do it, and it's a very cost-effective way of collecting information which can enable local authorities to know who owns properties, but also actually the revenue to know as well. So actually it's a win all round.
Certainly, I think that councils who now we've got the private rented sector at 20% of all properties, it's grown exponentially, hasn't it, over the last 20 years. And it's changed the way local authorities ought to be running their businesses, for the want of a better word, because it's important where you've got certain types of housing where you might have vulnerable people. So then, whether it's to do with flooding or whether the electrics go out and you know the red team have to go into action and take round electric fires or whatever it is, it's important for those councils to know who their loyal subjects are and to look after them. So certainly looking at the advice that came out after the Angela Watkins private members bill and 10-minute rule bill, that would be something very interesting that we could look at.
Okay, and maybe right to authorities say what their powers actually are, because a lot of them simply don't use them. Yeah. Okay, that'd be helpful, Minister. Thank you. Helen.
The government's announced a year ago, February 2017, that it will introduce a new affordable private rent policy to be set out in the forthcoming revised National Planning Policy Framework. Can you explain what this policy will cover, how it will apply, and the difference it will make over and above the current affordable housing policies that local authorities are able to apply?
Yeah, there's 2 or 3 things really. So let's set the base for starters. So the single most important things that we can do to help with affordability is to increase supply. So we have delivered over 346,000 new affordable homes since 2010, including 248,000 affordable homes for rent. And in 2012, the government launched the £3.5 billion PRS guarantee schemes to help grow the sector. So we want to drive better practice in the sector. So the build-to-rent operators don't charge tenancy fees. They quite often offer 3-year family-friendly tenancies, which give renters stability and security. But of course, there's no obligation on a tenant to take that up if they want the flexibility of a 6-month or a 12-month one. So we're looking at where build-to-rent has affordable rents, certainly at 80% of the local housing market rent, and it could be that as a part of the planning issues and part of the negotiations with the good old-fashioned 106 agreements, that local councils can ask for that rent to be even lower as a percentage of the area. And that's something that we're asking councils to look at for the future.
So this applies. So it's essentially it's an extension of the powers of the policies rather on affordable housing.
That's right. Specifically about build to rent.
Built specifically to rent. Have you got any plans, therefore, to look at the viability assessment regime, which is currently? I mean, what I'm struggling to imagine is how any. We already have a situation where many developers are able to deliver far less than the council's stated planning policy level of affordable housing, even at the level of up to 80% of market rent, because they are able to argue on grounds of viability, not always accessible in the public domain, that they can't afford to do so. What I'm struggling to imagine is how any private sector organisation delivering specifically rent in the private sector would accept any reduction in the level of market rent that they were able to charge, and how therefore the policy would work in practice. Right.
I completely understand why you have a level of scepticism. However, the good news is that the big national long-term investors are actually looking at this as a solid return investment for them. So the big pension funds and things like that, those are exactly the sorts of groups who are coming into and having 200 units at a time. So it is a real game changer.
But why would they be prepared to do that at less than market rent, and how will you equip local authorities to be able to force them to do that? That's my question. It's it's very different to rented accommodation provided by the social rented sector.
I suppose you and I are starting from different points on this. It isn't a matter of forcing people, and it isn't a matter of waving a magic wand. It's a very good return for them, and they know that as a matter of public policy that it's a good thing to invest in. And so actually I am not having to make people do it. Businesses are making the choice to do it.
So, but my question is specifically about the affordable private rent.
I appreciate it. This is rent to build, and rent to build at affordable prices. That is what they are doing.
Okay, I leave that there. We have received evidence from lots of local authorities about the ways in which they are currently trying to intervene in the private rented sector, including rent deposit schemes and incentives to owners of empty properties to rent out their homes. Do you support these initiatives, and do you consider them to be a good use of local authority resources?
Absolutely. I know councils have been doing it for 20 years, and I'm amazed other councils haven't. We every council gives it a different name, but key money. So it's the deposit money to go in, because that's a huge incentive. Plus also, if there are, again, accidental landlords, you inherited granny's house, you don't know what to do, the council can actually manage it for you, if that is what you would like. And I'm amazed more councils don't do that. I mean, I don't think it's a London thing. I think it's maybe a regional thing, that this is more or more opportunity to do it. And I know loads of councils do it, and they will, in effect, not charge the 8% that a letting agent or a managing agent might charge, and they will be looking after the tenants whilst they're there, and they will know that the rent is going to get paid to the amateur landlord.
And are you actively monitoring the areas of the country, like London, but not only London, where there is this intense pressure on the level of rent in the private sector bumping up against the LHA cap, and where there is evidence from the National Audit Office and elsewhere that is increasing homelessness? Are you keeping that situation under active review, and have you got plans to argue with the Treasury for an increase in resources under Bob's Act and through other means to stop the increase in homelessness, which we know is happening as a consequence of the inability of local authorities to intervene in that way?
Yeah. As some London prices are coming down as the supply goes up, I think that's actually going to be quite an interesting problem to actually attack going forward. But I think Anne probably wants to say something.
I was just going to reiterate something the Minister said before. So we're looking at the evidence with DWP about the interaction between housing benefit and the private renters sector. We haven't got all that information yet, and we need to look at the different impact across the country, but we will pull that together and see if there's anything we need to do as a result.
And I think that's important because, I would say this, wouldn't I? But I find it hard to accept the premise of your question. So I think it might be a bit of a London thing. And, you've got one of the highest private rented sector groupings of any of the MPs around this select committee. So I do appreciate why it's such a personal cause for you.
Okay. Can we move on now to the draft tenant fees bill?
Oh, this is the exciting one, Chairman. Let's go for this.
Absolutely. Well, okay. All of your own making, Minister. Right, Mark.
Minister, let's start the even more exciting part of default fees. I think it was quite interesting from witnesses on both sides of the argument, tenants and indeed landlords, that there's a nervousness about the definition of default fees. There are pros and cons about how specific you are, and we've had discussions with your officials in a previous evidence session. Why doesn't the draft bill seek to now specifically define those terms so that everyone knows exactly where they stand?
Genuinely, we don't think it's practical to impose that. We think that the comprehensive list of the different types of permitted default fees is very problematic and may lead to difficulties in the future owing to the list being incomplete or insufficient. We do intend to provide non-statutory guidance for landlords that addresses the appropriate level of those charges that are permitted. And the guidance notes really are very helpful about what is permitted and what is not permitted.
And when you say what is permitted and what is not permitted, is that an intention where something comes up and you look at it and think, that particular activity we will now say is not permitted? Or is it that you're going to establish clear principles?
Yes, it's that way round.
Which they will be judged.
Yeah, the principles will be... this is a draft bill. And again, Chairman, I should have said straight away, we really are very grateful for the scrutiny that you've given this. It is most helpful. There's all sorts of opportunities for rethinks from what you've been able to really dig down into. And the evidence that you've taken from everybody else. So there will be almost the minimum list of areas where anything could be possibly charged. But basically, the rule is there is no charge.
Right, so there will be a list of specific items, but there will also be a set of principles?
So
Becky.
there won't be a list of specific default fee charges for the reason the Minister explains. That the chances are, we want to put this on the face of the bill and getting a list correct or exhaustive. We don't want to be in a place where we're amending primary legislation in a year's or so's time. So the bill will set out that where a fee is when the tenant agrees their contract with their landlord and they're made aware that they would have to be liable for such a fee in the instance of a default, then that would be a default fee. So that the agent or landlord would need to be clear with the tenant at the time the tenancy agreement is agreed as to whether or not the tenant would be liable for paying that fee and what the amount that would be charged is. What we're intending to put in guidance is examples of what we see to be the most commonly, so very much that list that you were describing, but so that we don't have a position where we can't add to it, and with a suggested level of the type of fee that we would consider to be appropriate in those situations. And that would be non-statutory guidance to help landlords and tenants to understand those types of default fee.
Okay. As you rightly say, Minister, one of our roles in trying to pre-scrutinise is work out where problems may come up and therefore make the legislation better. One of the examples that's come up a number of times is where things happen that aren't necessarily a change in the tenancy, but nevertheless may allow someone to slip a charge in of some sort. Good example, joint tenancies. Two names.
Yep.
I think the question is, do you consider a fee for a change of sharer? So one of the names changing in a joint tenancy, do you consider that a default fee should be able to be included under that? Or is that something where actually, as far as you're concerned, there's no change in the tenancy, therefore there is no fee chargeable?
Interestingly, this is something that we listened to as the evidence has been given, and Becky and Anne have been working very hard on this, and particularly Becky indeed. So we have listened, and we think that this is an area where further clarity is needed, and we intend to permit a charge for a variance on the tenancy, and charges related to a change of sharer where these are requested by the tenant. Such fees are not classed as default fees, so it would be appropriate.
Let me just clarify that.
It would be appropriate to charge a fee for a change of tenancy for a sharer when the tenant is asking for that.
Right, okay. So where Mr. and Mrs. Prisk are the two names on the tenancy, and Mrs. Prisk, for whatever reason, is no longer on the tenancy, we won't go there. But nevertheless, in those circumstances, you're saying that that of itself is a legitimate charge?
Yes, in effect, you're bringing in a new name.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Can I just qualify?
Yes,
that
okay.
isn't in the bill as drafted at the minute, but we've heard the need for clarity. So as part of the revision of the bill, that's an area we're going to look to change so that it is clear.
Yes.
So it's not as drafted at the minute. We recognise it's unclear as to whether or not that would be a default. What we plan to do is in the revised bill make it clear in the legislation that that is a permitted charge.
And then the other half of this is if you've set those out in guidelines, is the ability of trading standards to be able to then enforce this effectively. And this comes round to this, the old lawyer's phrase about reasonableness. Do you feel at the moment, as the bill is currently set up, that trading standards are going to have the right powers to be able to strongly enforce this? Or is this again something which, having listened to what we've been looking at, you are recognising that actually there's a bit of change needed to be there?
Yes. Is almost the answer to that question. That's not very good grammar, is it? We have listened, and again, we think that trading standards do have the powers and the capabilities of coping with where there is not a breakdown, but where they've overstepped the mark, and so they need to be brought back into account. So that, again, it's a matter of civil penalty for the trading standards to deal with that. But we actually think that the non-statutory guidance should be strong enough and clear enough that would be rare for that to be the case. But it is the trading standards that would deal with it.
Right. And reasonableness both in terms of the type of activity being charged for and indeed the type of charge. In other words, how much? Because one of the different discussions we've been having is, should you just cap fees rather than ban them? Is what you've just described going to apply both to the nature of the activity being charged for and the level of charge as well?
Yeah, Becky, do you want to answer?
Yeah, so the guidance is intended to cover both the type of charge and the level of charge. It's worth pointing out that already there are protections in existing consumer protection legislation around unfair contract terms, so charging something like £500 for a lost key would obviously qualify as an unfair contract term. So, but what we're letting set out in the guidance is types of default fees, and we gained evidence through the consultation that we did around what sort of types of fees would qualify in that section and what a level would be appropriate for that type of fee to give landlords and tenants guidance essentially. And then going on to your point about local authorities, we also intend to work well with the lead enforcement authority to provide guidance to local authorities to support them in carrying out their enforcement duties and to ensure there's consistency in the way that they're enforcing the provisions.
And very much to back up what Becky says and to really underline it, this business about the Consumer Rights Act 2015, agents have a duty to show prominently on their offices and on their website, and we again have worked out that if you do something on the Zooplas of this world, that they also, not Zoopla per se, but the letting agents must have on that advert as well all of their fees and charges, so that they're set out clearly from day one. Because what we've found so often is that you think you're going to be renting a place for $600 a month or $1,000 a month or $2,000 a month, whatever it is, but then what you don't realise from that first advert that you see, the fees and charges that are there. So that's why we've come to this point where we just don't think that that's acceptable anymore.
Okay, thanks. Just moving on, I mean, I think we're all trying to make sure that the intention that we share, that tenants shouldn't be paying these fees by and large, is actually maintained in practice. So tenants will pay, or can be asked to pay a holding deposit when it's being considered whether the tenancy is appropriate. But is it your understanding that, as drafted in legislation, if tenants fail a reference check, they can lose the holding deposit?
No, I don't think so. I think it's if they lied about other issues that would mean that the landlord wouldn't have gone to that stage in the first place. The only fee that the landlord can retain is the cost of that Experian or whatever it is that they've used. So the rest of that holding fee would come back to the potential tenant.
To clarify, the Minister is right in that it doesn't necessarily, if you fail a reference check, that doesn't mean that the landlord can retain the holding deposit, because if the tenant, for example, it's to do with providing false or misleading information that then materially affects the tenant's ability to rent the property, and it's in those instances that the landlord can retain the holding deposit, or again we'll be providing guidance to say, as the Minister sets out, that should only really be the amount of the cost to the landlord in carrying out the reference check. But if a tenant was to provide factually correct information and done everything as they should have done, but fail a reference check, the landlord wouldn't be able to retain the holding deposit in those instances.
Right. Okay. So it's false and misleading information is a nice phrase, but sometimes that can be innocently provided. Someone may not know that they've got a black mark on Experian because they had a dispute over a £4 mobile phone bill a few months before. But under those circumstances, even when the tenant hasn't knowingly done it, but has done it innocently, they can still end up paying, can they?
That's our position, yes.
Yeah. So it's not intention, it's simply if the information is wrong that the tenant provides.
And if that materially affects the landlord's ability to let. I should say this has been a really difficult issue to balance in terms of what's fair to the landlord and what's fair to the tenant. And where we did consider whether we should put whether the tenant has knowingly provided false or misleading information, and we did really explore that option. But then the burden of proof would still sit with the landlord, and it's very difficult for a landlord to prove in a court of law as to whether or not a tenant has done something knowingly. What a landlord can do is demonstrate whether the information the tenant provided seriously affected their decision to let the property, and given that the landlord is going to be liable for a serious fine if they don't return the holding deposit, we thought the way of balancing this in the fairest way to both tenant and landlord was not to include the knowingly test. I recognise that will create some situations, like you say, where unfortunately a tenant might in all good faith provide some false or misleading information and lose their holding deposit. With the greatest respect, that would already happen now. We're not unfortunately going to be able to solve every ill, but we are hopefully going to make the situation better for 99.9% of tenants.
The charge can only be, or the element of the deposit that's withheld can only be that amount which relates to the cost of the reference check.
That's not what the legislation stipulates, but we've heard that suggested in the oral evidence, and we are considering that. But at the minute, the way the legislation is drafted is the landlord can retain part or all of the holding deposit if the tenant provides false. We are having a think about as a result of the evidence. Yes.
Sorry, Mary, you want to come in?
Sorry, yes, it is on that, and it's around the balance. I've spoken to some letting agents in my area, and they're really concerned. They think that this is sort of a London-based bill, if you like, and that they charge their low cost and good value. So around this issue of getting the fee right, would it be, so the cost of a reference check, how would that be set? Because that might be set at a different rate in London than it would in Cheadle.
Well, it's literally the cost of the reference check. That's the difference. The holding fee is only that you're saying that I really want to go for that house and stop everybody else bidding for it, sort of thing. That's what a holding fee is for. So if it then turns out that unless they have knowingly misled, that it finishes for whatever reason, then the cost that the landlords have actually paid for those reference checks. I mean, it could be that the prospective tenant will do their own reference checks and then present that, in which case it's up to the landlord whether he accepts that or not.
Okay, so the costs that are involved intrinsic in running an office and having somebody carrying out the reference checks aren't going to be part of this at all?
No.
Becky, no.
So, we again, this is something I'm aware that a lot of landlords and letting agents have raised, that they think the cost for a reference check should be, allowed under the ban. It's not something we agree with. Landlords make the decision as to what level of referencing they want to carry out, and that's part of them being a landlord. I think going back to the point that was raised earlier about whether the fees should be capped or that there's different fees in different areas of the country, I don't think any of that gets away from the fact that the tenant doesn't have a choice in paying these fees and what the level of fees are. The letting agent is chosen by the landlord. The fees that are negotiated between landlord and letting agent and the levels of charges around them is very much within the landlord's gift to negotiate, not the tenants. And actually, we really do think that the ban is the best way of achieving sort of the more fair functioning market in lettings that is seen in other areas, i.e. the party that contracts the service pays for the service, be that referencing or be that other types of fees. And that's why we've taken the decision that actually reference fees should be included within the ban. But again, as the Minister says, if the tenant chooses to go out and procure their own services, the ban doesn't prevent them from doing it. It's only where their landlord requires them to go out and pay for them as a condition of the tenancy.
But Mary, your point about that different areas of the country probably applies to the default fees as well, which you probably were seeking to get in as well.
Yeah. So basically, in one area of so in London, the costs would be quite different from in other areas of the country. Is that going to be taken into account?
It's an interesting premise because I've got a colleague who's looking to rent a property at the minute, and the different letting agencies, it's between £200 and £600. And this is in regional Derbyshire. So I think it's more nationwide than some people might think.
And on the specific reference checks, it's worth pointing out that the holding deposit is a week's rent. So obviously, the rent where the reference checks are more, then the holding deposit is likely to be more as well, because the amount of rent per week is likely to be higher. So yes.
Okay, on to the security deposit. We've had different evidence that 6 weeks might be too long. Shelter and citizen advisor said, well, actually 4 weeks is the norm, so why are you extending it to 6? Landlords are saying, well, actually 6 weeks, 4 weeks would only be the amount of a regular rent payment, and if a tenant leaves without paying the rent, leave nothing left beyond it. So how are you thinking about that in terms of looking at the evidence so far?
Absolutely, and the evidence really is very, very mixed. I mean, as it happens, the average deposit taken currently is actually 5 weeks. So we are actually expecting it to go to 6 weeks because specifically the issue of walking away on that last month. And, again, I've said this a number of times. I mean, it's my complete intention to be even-handed to the good landlords as well as to the good tenants. And we think that 6 weeks is the right level.
And you've made made your mind up about that, have you, in terms of your position?
Have I made my mind up? I think I have made my mind up.
I should say this has very much been informed by the consultation. We did a long public consultation which had just under 5,000 responses. 68% of people agreed that deposits should be capped. The vast majority of responses, the most popular responses, were 4 or 6 weeks. Tenant organisations actually tended to come even less than that, sort of around 2-3 weeks. Landlords were more than that, sort of around 2 months. Letting agents tended to preferred answer was about 6 weeks. We did actually explore looking at 4 and 6 weeks, both of them. We very much sort of heard the feedback from landlords around their concern that actually 4 weeks rent left them less flexibility to let to tenants with pets or things like that. And we also heard, as the Minister said, the concern about tenants walking away without not paying their final month's rent, which is the decision why we've gone to 6 weeks. What I should say is that we still expect, as happens now, for landlords to consider on a case-by-case basis what's the appropriate amount of deposit to be taken. By setting a cap at 6 weeks, we're not automatically saying all landlords should do that. And, you know, the evidence shows they aren't already do that. That, you know, the average is around 5 weeks and they can set what do they want. What we're trying to do is prevent landlords that are setting unreasonably high deposits, which has a real serious impact on tenants' ability to afford a property, to actually not be able to do that anymore.
Okay. Yes.
Can I just ask a supplementary on that? Was there a disparity between furnished and unfurnished?
Sorry.
Was there any disparity between furnished and unfurnished in their responses?
We didn't ask that specific question, and the responses didn't come out as to whether there was a difference. But I mean, the deposit data that we have is from the 3 tenancy deposit schemes, and the overall average is around 5 weeks rent, and that's been fairly stable.
Okay. And can I just ask, on the security deposit, you're saying sort of 6 weeks an amount, but in terms of going back to the holding deposit, is there a...
It's 1 week.
It's 1 week?
Yeah.
But is there a maximum length of time between a holding deposit being taken and the start of a tenancy? I may have missed something in previous...
If it doesn't go through, they have to pay it back in 7 days. But minus the amount. Yeah.
Sorry, Mr. Irrespective of whether it goes through or doesn't, is there a maximum in advance payment, i.e. the term of the advance payment in holding a property? There are many cases where people have to put down holding deposits way in advance of the start of the tenancy, particularly, say, in high churn, such as student accommodation.
Sure.
I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but yes, the bill does set out a period that it should be held for. That basically the landlord and tenant should agree how long the holding, you know, basically taking a holding deposit is saying, I will let this property to you unless something goes wrong or whatever. If the landlord and tenant should agree a date upon which the tenancy agreement will be entered into, and if they don't, it's a period of about 14 days, 15 days to do. But if the landlord and tenant could then extend that mutually, for example, if something had happened and the tenant needed to provide extra information, then the landlord could say, okay, can we extend this period? And the bill gives them the flexibility to do that.
So with student properties, 10 months is quite typical, is it? Is that what you found?
I mean, yeah, but students are an odd case in that, yes, they do tend to almost up to a year in advance agree the tenancy. But
is that viewed as acceptable?
But the holding deposit is essentially until the tenancy is agreed. With students, they actually tend to agree the contract. It's not that they're holding the holding deposit. Actually, they'll take the security deposit, and if they take it into the tenancy, the holding deposit would be refunded or taken off the amount of security deposit that is taken from the tenant. Actually, what's happening is the tenant is entering into the contract 10 months in advance of it commencing.
And it's a different thing. Yeah. It's a completely different thing. So, okay, good. And also, it's one of those things where if the landlord gets it wrong, there is a huge fine on the landlord, and if he gets it wrong twice within 5 years, the banning order comes in, and it is hugely draconian. So they are not going to get this wrong, or rather, they'd be completely stupid too.
Liz, you've got to follow up on this, and then on to your own question as well. Yes, again.
The mention of pets has reminded me that the committee has previously considered the issue of what's a default payment and what's coming out of the security payment. Has any more thought been given to that, about clarifying that position?
We have, yeah. I think we provided further evidence to the committee to say that we're grateful to you raising that point, and we want to make sure that any money that could be sort of raised or come through the security deposit at the end of the tenancy, making sure that would also essentially be what is recoverable as a default fee, and making sure there's consistency across those two things.
Thank you.
That was really helpful as a piece of evidence, sort of partway through this scrutiny. So thank you for that.
So moving on to a different question, Dr. David Smith from the Residential Landlords Association told the committee that, you might want to write this down, Schedule 1, subparagraph 6, which permits a drop in rent levels if it's the result of an agreed or contractual variation, was clearly a mistake. Is it a mistake?
It wasn't a mistake, no, unless the Minister wants to answer.
No, I think the sensible answer is to say that we are working with Parliamentary Council to ensure that the bill achieves its intention of preventing front-loading of the rent without prohibiting an agreed rent decrease later in the tenancy.
Right. And will that be clarified in the bill?
So we're working. I think the concern was that this was a concern that was raised in the consultation, essentially, that because rent is a permitted payment, the way that actually it could be of charging fees by the back door, essentially, is to front load the front month's rent, which is what Schedule 1, Clause 6 is all about, to try and prevent that behaviour. I think where the concerns have been raised that actually the sub-clause 2 of Article 1.6, Schedule 1.6, whatever it is, would sort of render that unnecessary. What that specific part of the clause was to do was to enable landlord and tenant to agree a rent decrease later in the tenancy, and we are looking with legal to make sure what our policy intention is, we can be quite clear about, is we don't want landlords to front load the rent, and we're just checking with our Parliamentary Council as to making sure that the legislation absolutely does achieve that. Yes, it has.
Yes,
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you.
Excellent.
So because we are very keen to see, I think the committee would be united on this, to see longer tenancies in operation. So a tenant signs a tenancy agreement, but the market actually determines that rent levels generally have been down.
Yeah.
And so the landlord agrees to reduce the rent on a property. Are we saying that in this draft legislation as it stands, that they would or would not be permitted to reduce levels of rent under those circumstances or others?
They can, and it is to reflect market changes. That ability will be there.
Okay,
that's
fine.
the second Section 2 bit.
Yeah,
that
okay,
Becky was
fine.
talking about.
Just,
no,
I
absolutely.
just want to clarify that.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Matt. Thank you, Chair. Minister, without legal aid or recoverable legal costs, is there any realistic prospect of tenants actually taking landlords to county court to enforce their legal right to these unlawful fees?
The straightforward answer is yes. But then a longer answer is that we did actually consider whether the first tier tribunal would be an appropriate route for tenants to recover their fees. But tribunals are unable to enforce their decisions, which is why we do actually go back to the county court level. We think that the bill makes provision for local authorities to support tenants to recover their fees, and the tenants are also able to recover their fees through trading standards taking enforcement action. So that is the route that we would imagine, if it got to that stage, that's how it would work.
But do you accept that there are many people in the private rental sector, quite vulnerable people, perhaps less familiar with these sorts of processes, and will see this as a huge barrier to actually taking it that far?
I appreciate what you're saying about some tenants being vulnerable, but I think that this is somewhere where the Citizens Advice Bureau work really well hand in hand and help vulnerable tenants in particular. There are standard letters that they use to help them draft those and write them on behalf of the vulnerable tenants. But even more importantly, I think that there are issues now about the trading standards as the lead authority being able to recover those fees and keep those fees subject to whatever the tenant ought to be allowed. It means that there is more incentive for local authorities to work hand in hand, particularly with vulnerable tenants. But we don't think it's going to get to that stage. We actually think that the risk of the county court issue will be so high that actually landlords will liaise more appropriately.
I admire your optimism.
Yes.
I'm not so sure that I share it, and from my experience in my area, that there is a great many people who actually feel the power is very much with the landlord, and I appreciate this legislation is working to change that balance. But they do see the prospect of challenging landlords as a very too difficult to just not. They don't feel confident to do it. They feel very weak or disadvantaged in that sort of exchange, the potential exchange with the landlord. Do you not accept that?
I do understand what you say, and absolutely, there will be certain groups in society who consider themselves more vulnerable and less able to undertake this. But I think the changes that we're making, particularly so from the April 17 changes as well, it just means that the trading standards will be on their side.
Okay.
Can I also point to as well just the wider commitment about redress as well, and requiring landlords to join a redress scheme, and actually that will help ensure that landlords are aware of what they should be doing. And I think actually tenant-led enforcement, that tenants, it's much clearer for a tenant that they shouldn't be charged these fees and not accepting the premise of the fees in the first place, and we'll be encouraging that through the guidance that the Minister mentioned earlier around the how-to guides as well.
I think, although it may only seem like another piece of paper, but exactly as Becky says, the how-to guides I think are going to be quite crucial in this in the future.
Okay.
Empowering people and pointing them in the right direction.
Okay. We've heard that if the bill stopped a landlord from getting possession until any unlawful fee has been repaid, this would be more effective for tenants than having to pursue their own claims in the county court. Don't you agree?
Becky?
Sorry, just repeat that.
We've heard that if the bill stopped a landlord from getting possession until any unlawful fee has been repaid, this would be more effective for tenants than having to pursue their own claims in the county court.
So not allowing a landlord to serve like a Section 21, essentially. Mm-hmm. It's an interesting suggestion. It's something that we use in other areas of private rented sector legislation, and for example around gas safety and so forth. I mean, obviously, as the Minister has explained, the enforcement route that we've taken here is very much that it sits with trading standards to enforce, and that actually we would be encouraging tenants not to understand that they shouldn't be charged fees in the first place. So that's the enforcement mechanism we've chosen. We haven't gone down the Section 21 route there for this reason, in this instance, sorry.
Mm-hmm. And can I just ask, with authorities, typical authorities that have responsibility for housing, the trading standards also sits within those authorities, or does it sit if you have a three-tier local authority structure, does it differ?
It does. It's with the upper tier authorities. There's no getting around that. And it's a conversation I've been having with the civil servants. But this is consumer protection law. And so although they will work hand in hand with environmental health or whatever on the 11 hazard areas, but this is consumer protection law, which is why the trading standards are the appropriate people at the moment in time.
At this moment. Interesting.
Mary.
Just a quick one.
Sorry, Mom.
In terms of the recovery through the county courts, would it be anticipated that that would be small claims procedure largely?
Yes.
Yeah. And my understanding is that small claims procedure could be quite difficult for some people, but has been made more straightforward. Is that then anticipated that trading standards would be able to give a steer towards that, and therefore that would be part of the guidelines?
Yeah, so we put provision in the bill for local authorities to help them, and we will again, as part of what we tend to do, it is part of sort of almost how to use the bill for tenants and landlords, providing help on all these areas.
And then any way that could be made more simple and explained to people would be really beneficial, I think.
Okay.
Thank you, very helpful. Thank you very much. Chairman, did Mark want to come in?
Yes, he does. Is the clock finished? Yes,
Indeed. Thank you, Chairman.
I probably don't want to hear this, but go on, I'll give it a go.
Ms Perks referred to, obviously, landlords now being expected to be registered. And this is a huge number of people. I mean, this is several 100,000 people. Are you satisfied this isn't actually going to turn out to be what Sir Humphrey would consider a brave decision on your part?
I knew I shouldn't have asked you, should I? I think the truth is that the private rented sector is so big now, and that we have a duty to make sure that tenants live in safe accommodation, and that we've got to the stage where it's the right thing to do. And I think I'll leave it at that.
And very briefly, Chairman, I mean, the law-abiding, decent landlord will do what the Lord says. The rogue, the crook, the person who's probably also involved in human trafficking and lots of other grim things, they're going to hide around the corners of this in all sorts of ways. And so I think the concern a lot of landlords have said is that, well, they will do the decent thing. how realistic is it that the way in which landlords are going to be asked to license themselves and all the rest of it, that how is that actually going to deal with those rogues? Isn't it the other elements to this that really matter?
Well, I live in a semi-rural area, but I neighbour a city. And so the issues that the police and environmental health and local housing authority deal with on things like people trafficking and outside more rural areas, the gangmasters and things like that, they have had some astonishingly good results. I don't want to see those issues becoming the norm anywhere across our country, but the incentive for the local officials to really bite into that. I've been astonished at the enthusiasm to get into it. So I think that these prospective new rules, this new bill, will really kick on with local officials who have pride where they live, pride where they represent, and this will strengthen their arm in those areas. And I don't think any of us, want to read the dreadful stories that we read about with rogue landlords, but it will give the incentive for the authorities to really kick on.
In terms of the issue of the unlawful fees and how tenants may get them back, I mean, county courts, right, they can be quite off-putting, the whole process. Is it not possible that if we looked at the first tier tribunal as the way of doing it, there is a problem about enforcing orders there. But I understand that it is possible for a judgment in the first tier tribunal to be registered in the county court, to actually be enforceable as a county court order, even though it's made by the first tier tribunal. Has that been looked at as a way?
It has, Becky, hasn't it?
Yeah, we did look at that. As you say, it's just the time that would take to then get the decision to be enforced by the county court, so we just considered it more expedient to enable the tenant to go directly to the county court.
So there's no way that your colleagues in the Justice Department could actually make sure that happened seamlessly?
Well, we strive for joined-up governance, don't we, Chairman?
Maybe you said that you don't believe that will work.
Essentially, this is the same mechanism that we've taken with regards to the enforcement of the tenancy deposit legislation. So we've mirrored that in mirroring to support tenants to understand what action they can take in instances where they're charged on unfair fees or that the landlord doesn't do what they're supposed to do. I'm happy to go and have another conversation with the Ministry of Justice to explore that option for you.
Okay. Right. Liz.
Yes, thanks. I want to ask about resources. And the LGA told the committee that the retention of civil penalties will not sufficiently address funding pressures. And the Chartered Trading Standards Institute said that keeping the money from the fines doesn't even cover a proportion of the costs. Will you provide direct funding to local authorities for these duties?
Well, first and foremost, it's only been going since April 17. The idea of the ability to keep these fines up to £30,000. Similarly, before the fines of £5,000 and the banning orders, that is relatively new business as well. So I'm sorry that they feel that way, but our view is it will cover it, and particularly, even more importantly, the getting the rent back as well, particularly as that in a number of cases with its housing benefit is public money. And so I think that they will go after that. Does the New Murderlands Fund help as well?
So we said to the committee previously that we, once the policy position is finalised, obviously we set out an assessment of the impact of the costs on local authorities as we perceive them to be, and we believe that actually the allowing them to keep the civil penalties will help to fund the enforcement. We believe it will be self-financing, and also believe that actually it should be the responsibilities of the landlords and agents that flout the law to fund the enforcement. We have, as set out in the explanatory notes in the financial section of those notes, set out that we will also be funding a lead enforcement authority to provide support and guidance in that way. We will, as we go finalise the policy position, can undertake the full new burdens assessment, and that will inform that question as to whether or not there needs to be any additional funding.
Okay. So I guess I sound a bit like a broken record to those who have been before, but where authorities take a proactive approach and one that avoids the need for going to court, do you acknowledge that doing that work will mean that the retention of civil penalties doesn't recover the costs of that work? So if you're not going to court because you're a good local authority and you've talked to your landlords or whatever, you're actually doing the work without the money?
So that's why we're proposing to create the lead enforcement authority, to create the guidance to help local authorities do some of that. And we're also looking at the tenant-led enforcement to make sure that actually, you know, if none of these fees are charged in the first place and they don't need to be recovered, then actually that reduces the amount that the local authority has to do and enables them to tackle their resources on actually tackling that real criminal element, rather than the people that might just be doing it wrong because they don't know better, where they haven't got any sort of criminal intent, they just don't understand what they should be doing. I think we've heard the points around proactive enforcement, and it's something we will consider through the new burdens assessment.
Okay.
So to repeat, there is this thing called the new burdens assessment. Thank you, good. Because I mean that's quite important that we are open to about that.
Yeah, good. So although this approach to funding is mirrored in the 2016 Housing and Planning Act, is there a risk that authorities will be seen as judge, jury and executioner with these, recouping their costs from fines?
I think that's a very interesting question. I think that if a landlord has done something wrong and if they've broken the law, then they should pay the penalty. If it's particularly to do with any of the 11 tests, then they should pay up straight away and fix things. And as this is about consumer protection law, the trading standards people will know the levels that is the appropriate level of fine, and I think that's appropriate too, and that's how it should be.
I should also just qualify that actually the landlord or agent would have a right to appeal. It's not that that the trading standards is saying this is the fine and that's categorically it. There will be a right to appeal for the landlord and agent if they feel that the trading standards has imposed an unfair fine or imposed a fine in a situation where there shouldn't be one. And also part of the lead enforcement authority's duty will be to issue guidance to ensure that actually the levels of fines charged in certain instances do relate to the crime committed, essentially.
And do we have any experience from the Housing and Planning Act provisions as to whether this is working out in practice, or experience there?
Very early days, isn't it? That's the problem. But we do want to keep a weather eye on that, because there is, this is now an extension of what came in it's a potential extension of what came in April 17, and so we will be keeping that under review.
I think it's fair to say local authorities have been very supportive of that there, and I think the evidence that the committee has heard throughout this session has welcomed the additional fines. A lot of people have felt that actually it wasn't a significant enough deterrent, and that was definitely the evidence we heard from the consultation, that fees of only up to £5,000, for example, which is present in other letting agent regulations, wasn't sufficient, and that's why we specifically consulted on it. And the vast majority of consultation responses said that the £30,000 fine, not just to enable local authorities to retain the money, but going back to your earlier point about helping them to proactively prevent it, actually that's more of a deterrent to landlords and agents from doing it wrong. It won't just be a cost of business, and sort of hoping you don't get caught.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Joe.
Okay. Why isn't there in the bill a duty to issue guidance about enforcement, only a power?
Kick off and then I'll
So we've listened to the committee on this, and we recognise that this is very much something we intend the lead enforcement authority to do. So we're going to look at making sure that is a duty, and we're looking with lawyers at how best we achieve that through the act. Or the bill, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself.
But very importantly, we are very grateful for the work, the committee, and the evidence that's come up so far. So that we have listened to the committee, and we do intend to place a duty on the lead enforcement authority. So thank you for that.
Now, can I just clarify then as well, obviously, about the disproportionate penalties that would occur if there was no guidance and it was just a power? And it becoming a bit of a postcode lottery, if you like, if one area was it proportionally high, disproportionately high to another area.
So that's very much what would be part of the lead authority. That
would be
to ensure that there is that consistency, and that's an approach, again, something that was very heavily supported in the consultation, because it happens in the estate agency sector, and recognising on the ground actually your estate agent might well be your letting agent as well, and actually trying to marry up how that works across the two sectors. And it's an approach, having that lead enforcement authority, to provide that consistency that's worked well, and that's what we're seeking to replicate.
Okay. So is the idea that authorities should be allowed to take into account their funding needs as well when setting the financial penalty in an individual case?
Not their funding needs, their costs, definitely. You know, this isn't meant to be topping up the general support grant. This is covering their costs.
I think it goes back to Liz's earlier question, doesn't it? You know, obviously, if there are areas that are not adequately resourced or have, you know, funding difficulties for whatever reason, I mean, so some of the evidence that we've got back is relating to that. So I think it goes back to that. You know, if their funding, if they haven't got the resources or the capacity to be able to do that, and I think that's
it's interesting, isn't it? Because one of the pieces of evidence you had was that a particular council has already taken on a new member of staff in anticipation of the income they're going to get from doing this.
Okay. So, just to finish on this, are you sure the right of appeal against financial penalties as drafted is comprehensive enough to safeguard the penalty scheme against challenge under the Human Rights Act?
Definitely, yes. Becky, you've gone into this in great detail.
We have, and we're grateful to the committee for raising this point and the evidence that you've heard, and we're obviously going to ensure that the bill is fully compliant with European human rights legislation. The Minister cannot sign it off unless we do so that is something that we're very keen to make sure.
Poised.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chair. You were just talking about consistency being one of the advantages of having a lead enforcement agency. But what other values are there, or benefits are there to local trading standards?
What other benefits are there to local?
Yeah, what help or what assistance are local trading standards going to be getting from the lead enforcement agency?
Oh, I see. I beg your pardon. Okay.
So this is partly not just to provide guidance around actually how to carry out their roles, but also we've heard, you know, it's concern, and the committee's heard concern about local trading standards resources. So actually the lead enforcement authority's got the ability to step in and carry out enforcement action. I should be clear that only if the local trading and standards wants them to. You know, the primary enforcement responsibility does sit with the relevant local trading standards, but if they require additional support, particularly, for example, if it's a national agent, and that's again why trading standards are quite well placed to undertake the enforcement of this act, because they tend to spread larger areas, and letting agents as businesses tend to operate more across boundaries than perhaps landlords, then the lead enforcement authority would be able to step in and support the local trading standards to take action. The lead enforcement authority is also would have the ability to provide guidance to the public, to landlords, and to advice to the Secretary of State as well about how this is working, in order to inform any sort of improvements or changes that are needed in order to ensure that the policy delivers the intention that it has been or is being proposed to meet, essentially.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Matt.
Finally, this issue was raised actually quite at the beginning of our inquiry, if I suspect, which relates to the lack of an impact assessment, as opposed to what you actually did was an assessment of impact. Can you explain why you haven't followed the Cabinet Office guidelines and produced the document you did?
Okay, this is a draft bill. There is no duty on us to do what you have suggested with a draft bill. When it gets to the point of being the bill, then that is exactly, we will have a duty at that point, and that is exactly what we will do.
So why not? But you haven't followed the template, for example, for the impact assessment in the assessment of impact that you made. So it suggests to me, well, I think to the committee, that there's a lot more work that has to be done.
We do need to have independent verification of the work, and that is when we will then have the bill ready. There is no duty now to to have that work done at this point?
The issue is not about duty, especially given that you're subjecting the draft bill very wisely, I think, to pre-legislative scrutiny so that we can help improve it before it's the final version. But just doesn't seem any logic as to why you didn't follow the complete template. And I accept completely, Minister, you weren't in post when this was done.
Yeah, okay.
So blame somebody else.
No.
Blame me. No.
No,
I mean, our approach is very much in line with better regulation executive guidance on this. There is, as the Minister says, no requirement on us to complete a regulatory impact assessment in that format. We will do that, and we intend to do that, but we think it's sensible to do once we have a finalised policy position. We're not hiding anything. The analysis that is contained in the assessment of impact is exactly the same analysis, but we'll be looking to include in an impact assessment. The template we used was different because we weren't going through the independent verification, and we really wanted to make it clearer that we hadn't gone through that process yet. We will be looking to send an impact assessment to the Regulatory Policy Committee. That is not something we're trying to avoid. It's just that we wanted to do that at the most appropriate time, and we didn't consider that actually while the bill was still in draft and the policy position wasn't finalised, it was sensible to do. Otherwise, we'd have a number of different impact assessments floating around verified by the RPC, and we thought it was most sensible to do it once we had the policy position finalised. But it is something we will do.
Okay, all right.
Okay. Minister, thank you and your officials for coming this afternoon to answer quite a wide range of questions on the two subject areas that the committee is looking at, and just also thank your officials for the dialogue they've been entering into with us over the last few weeks, because I think we all want to make sure that we get the details of the legislation right to put into practice what the principles that we all want to see. So thank you for coming this afternoon. Order, that brings us to the end of the public proceedings.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much indeed.
The proceeding has ended.